Morning. Good morning, everyone. I'm Olivia Powis, head of the UK office at the CCSA, and we'll be chairing this session that's sponsored and curated by BP. It's the last of our sponsored sessions through the conference. The session will be on delivering the UK hydrogen strategy. In August, the UK released its long-awaited first ever hydrogen strategy, which sets out the steps that need to be taken this decade to build a thriving low-carbon hydrogen economy. Delivering the ambitions set out in the strategy will be crucial not only to support the transition to net zero, but also to develop a domestic hydrogen sector that's internationally competitive and puts the UK at the leading edge of countries developing this globally critical technology. The session today will give us the opportunity to hear from BEIS, project developers and the supply chain, who will share their views on the strategy and the key priorities going forward. The government is currently consulting on 3 specific areas, at the moment keeping us all very busy on hydrogen business models, low carbon hydrogen standards and the design of the hydrogen fund. It's a fast moving area and we need to make sure that we develop the right business models alongside the critical issue of ensuring the demand is created and new markets across industry, transport and heat. As with all the sessions that we've had in a conference, I'm sure you'll have lots of questions for our excellent lineup of speakers here. So please put your questions in Hoover whilst they're speaking, and we can come to those. Could I now introduce our first speaker? We've first got Will Lochhead, who's Deputy Director of the Industrial Carbon Capture and Hydrogen Business Models at BEIS. Will is a very experienced member of the CCUS policy team at BEIS. He's worked there since 2014 and is responsible for progressing the industrial and hydrogen business models. He previously led on setting up the legislative framework for the UK capacity market as part of the electricity market reform. Over to you, please, Will. Thank you.
Thanks, Olivia, and thanks everyone. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. So as Olivia said, I'm Will Lochhead. I head up the hydrogen business model part of the sort of hydrogen teams within BEIS. Many of you will know Rita Wadey, who leads on the sort of hydrogen economy, hydrogen strategy side, and Alison Conboy and Emma Bulmer, who lead on hydrogen production. So just to start with, if we just go to the next slide, the UK government's first hydrogen strategy was published in August. It focuses on driving progress to scale up the hydrogen economy in the 2020s, to deliver the 5 gigawatt of low carbon hydrogen production ambition that was set out in the Prime Minister's 10-point plan last November, and also position low carbon hydrogen to meet the ambitions and targets set out to meet Carbon Budget 6 and also ultimately the 2050 net zero target. I think, you know, key things that the strategy is looking to tackle is sort of recognizing there are a number of strategic challenges to developing that hydrogen economy and that 5 gigawatt of low carbon hydrogen production. That is, you know, the hydrogen, low carbon hydrogen at the moment is at a higher cost than the higher carbon counterfactual. That there is demand uncertainty and there is also it also remains quite a nascent market. There's at times first mover disadvantage, where first movers are exposed to higher costs, while follow-on users will receive the benefits of their actions, and that isn't necessarily rewarded. And also there's investor uncertainty in production, but also in associated networks and storage infrastructure. So key elements of the strategy include confirming that twin track approach to hydrogen production, supporting a variety of production methods, particularly electrolytic and also CCUS enabled production. Setting out how we will progress work to establish a hydrogen network and storage infrastructure, recognizing that's key to continue to build out that market and also end use market. The on demand side, that we expect to see demand for hydrogen increase across the economy, where industry will potentially be a lead market, but also seeing increasing demand in power, heavy transport, and potentially in heating. And also that a key part of the UK government's aims and ambitions for hydrogen is to secure the economic opportunities it presents to the UK and the economy. particularly domestic supply chain opportunities, and then building out into export opportunities as well. If we just move to the next slide. As part of the strategy, we set out a 2020s roadmap, which was designed to present a whole system approach to developing the hydrogen economy. It was created jointly with industry through the Joint Government Industry Hydrogen Advisory Council, which the BEIS Secretary of State co-chairs. And it's intended as a guide to what government and industry need to do and when to deliver that 5 gigawatt ambition, as well as build out that sort of hydrogen economy. It's based around different sort of time periods, so setting out, you know, actions and milestones in the early 2020s, mid 2020s, and late 2020s, as well as putting a marker down for that mid 2030s, sorry, timeline in terms of six carbon budget. So really it's sort of setting out what the policies, activities need to be in place to deliver our ambitions, and offers a blueprint for implementation, which we think will guide our work and our work jointly with industry over the coming months and years. Let's move to the next slide. And then alongside the hydrogen strategy, I also just wanted to touch on, as Olivia, you did, the three quite hefty consultations, which were also published alongside the strategy in August. One around the hydrogen business model, which I and my team were responsible for, and I'll cover briefly in the next slide, but also around the Net Zero Hydrogen Fund, the £240 million fund that was announced in the Prime Minister's 10-point plan, as well as a consultation on the low carbon hydrogen standard. I mean, just very briefly, in terms of the Net Zero Hydrogen Fund consultation, that's looking at proposing the scope, the design and delivery of that fund. It sets out some ambitions and priorities for the fund around grant funding to be provided on a co-funded basis, as well as, you know, looking at how and what it will fund in terms of development funding, as well as co-funding into CapEx co-funding into hydrogen production facilities. The low carbon hydrogen standard is about defining what is meant by low carbon hydrogen, allowing government to incentivise and support low carbon hydrogen production for supply across the energy system. And it's designed to provide a clear criteria for businesses seeking financial support from government for low carbon hydrogen production, such as through the Net Zero Hydrogen Fund and or hydrogen business model. So I think both are critical to meeting our ambitions. And if we just move to the next slide. And then alongside that, as I mentioned, we also published a consultation on the proposed hydrogen business model, which is designed to incentivize production and use of low carbon hydrogen, and design and overcome some of those strategic challenges around the cost gap between low carbon hydrogen and the fossil fuel counterfactuals, in order to unlock private investment in hydrogen production projects. How we set out in the slide here is just setting out some of the key features of the business model and the consultation. In the consultation, we've set out minded to positions on some areas, such as the payment mechanism, how you might deal with volume risk, while seeking more general views on other areas where we haven't yet reached a firm position, such as indexation of the strike price, contract length, as well as how you might allocate support, in particular to electrolytic projects, recognising that CCUS enabled hydrogen projects are eligible to participate in the ongoing CCUS cluster sequencing process. So hopefully many of you will have engaged on some of the consultation events that we've been holding on all three, but very briefly, the business model sets out the key proposed features, which are that we are proposing it's a private law contract between a hydrogen producer and a government counterparty. It is a variable premium mechanism, which is essentially akin to a contract for difference that you see in renewable electricity support, where the producer is paid the difference between a strike price and a reference price. And there's a sliding scale mechanism we're proposing, which manages a producer's volume risk, whereby the price they receive for each volume of hydrogen is higher for initial volumes and lower for later volumes. We're proposing that it is a single contractual business model available UK-wide and applicable to all types and scales of low carbon hydrogen production projects. We will allocate the first contracts to CCUS enabled projects through the ongoing cluster sequencing process. And for electrolytic projects, we have set out that we will design a separate allocation process starting from next year. And what we have said is that we will also provide further details on how the business model might be funded later this year, and that essentially is aligned to the spending review process. I mean, this is a very brief run through, but I think where we currently are is really seeking people's views on both the minded to positions as well as those more open-ended sort of questions around contract length, for example. The consultations all close on the 25th of October, and we will provide a response to the consultations in Q1 next year. For the business model, that will include a response to all the questions, but also the next sort of level of detail of the business model, working through further some of the minded to positions we set out, as well as confirming our positions around indexation, contract length, and so on. And finally, it will also set out a very high level indicative heads of terms for the business model. If we move to the next slide. And this slide, just to end, just sets out that, you know, now we've published the strategy and the package, we are very much sort of focused on delivering the ambitions and commitments that we've set out. And this just sort of sets out some of the key milestones going forward in terms of, you know, to the left in terms of the consultation period closing over the next week or so, to aim to finalising that business model by the end of 2022, and supporting and allocating those first contracts to projects from 2023. It's a very sort of high level, but sort of indicating the direction of travel and our move from strategy development to implementation and delivery. I'll leave it there because I recognise I think I've just about made it within 10 minutes, but happy to answer questions after Matt and Sam have been as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Will. It's great to sort of have that overview, and I think to see how far we've come, but also how much we've got to do before we start to allocate those first contracts in 2023. So it's we're working to a tight timescale. I will now introduce Matt Williamson, who is giving the project developer perspective. He is VP for Blue Hydrogen at BP and responsible for driving growth and business development in blue hydrogen. He's passionate about BP's purpose to reimagine energy for people and our planet, and leads a global team developing clean hydrogen projects. He joined BP in 1996 after graduating as a chemical engineer, and his first role was an environmental engineer, and following business development roles across upstream, he's delighted to be at the forefront of reducing carbon emissions. So over to you, Matt. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia. Hello, everybody. There's a lot to talk about hydrogen, and it's great to see it getting public recognition. My goal is to move on from the talking to the action to actually make it happen. If we go to the next slide. So, like many countries and regions, BP is going through a massive clean energy transformation. We're committed to becoming a net zero company and to help the world get to net zero as well. So whilst my children may still roll their eyes and say, "Dad, you work for an oil company," I'm confident that my grandchildren will see a very different business. For many years, we've been moving from oil to gas, but the big change is yet to come, and that's really the investment in renewable power, hydrogen, carbon capture. BP's already got a big wind and solar business, but by 2050, it will be 50 gigawatts, which is roughly equivalent to 60% of the UK's capacity at the moment. So a material change to BP's business. In CCUS, we're working on projects from the US through Asia. And in the UK, BP is very proud to be leading the Northern Endurance Partnership carbon capture project, which would remove CO2 emissions equivalent to about 10 million households. That's 50% of the UK's industrial cluster emissions, so a massive step forward for the UK in decarbonising. In low carbon hydrogen, we set our ambition to supply 10% of clean hydrogen in key geographies by 2030. That's not a journey to be carried out alone, so it's good to be working with good government partners like Will, partners like Sam from the technology part of it, and also working with customers who've got an ambition to get to low carbon products quickly. If we go to the next slide. So what do we believe about the future of low carbon hydrogen? To put it simply, it's real, it's going to be big, and it's going to be global. To achieve net zero, the world's going to need hydrogen. It's not about greenwashing, it's not about publicity. We have to make low carbon hydrogen for the lowest cost possible. And so industrial and commercial use of hydrogen is still early, but the potential for decarbonising big industry and transport is massive. So how big is big? I think we all struggle with the units for hydrogen. So the simplest way for me to look at it is by 2050, in a net zero world, hydrogen could be the same order of magnitude as gas is today. And for me and for BP, that's definitely a business that's worth being in. It's also a mix of blue and green hydrogen, so CCUS enabled or electrolytic. Local conditions will determine what is the lowest cost to get to low carbon hydrogen. Here in the UK, we like the government's approach on twin track for green and blue hydrogen. We think there's a big role for both. And we think both green and blue hydrogen needs to be and can be low carbon. And a low carbon hydrogen standard would definitely help with this. It's going to be global. We've announced projects in the UK, Europe, Australia, Middle East, and give me a couple more months and I'd add some more countries to that list. But it's nice to be in the UK because we know the UK's government goal is for UK to be a world leader in low carbon hydrogen. And we hope that within that T side can be a leader for low carbon hydrogen within the UK. So we go to the next slide. So 200 years ago, the first passenger steam train was in Teesside. 100 years ago, Teesside steel was exported to all corners of the world. And today there's a chance to lead on low carbon hydrogen in Teesside. So we're working on the H2T Side Project. It's a world scale clean hydrogen project. Approximately £1 billion of investments would be 20% of the UK clean hydrogen ambition by 2030. So the aim is to start up a blue hydrogen plant at the same time as the Northern Endurance Partnership, capturing the CO2 from the Teesside and Humber areas. CO2 would be transported offshore into the world-class CO2 store that is the Northern Endurance Partnership. And so it's not just about the CO2 removal, although that is massively important. It's going to effectively decarbonize 1 million households in the UK and bring broader benefits. So it's about jobs, attracting new industries. So the Teesside area's got lots of existing industries. We can safeguard those for 50 plus years by decarbonising, but it's also about attracting new low carbon businesses and give consumers a chance to start transitioning to low carbon hydrogen as an alternative to gas. It's not just about the, say, 2,000 construction roles or the 500 roles that be supported in operations by a hydrogen plant. It's also the chance to develop our UK supply chains. So on our H2T Side website, we have a supplier portal where we encourage companies to register their interest in supplying goods and services. Our hope is that the skills and supply chains developed to build and operate H2T Side can be exported to our other projects around the world. If Teesside could do it in steel, why not in hydrogen skills? But none of this happens without customers. So I do want to just touch on the next slide and talk about some of the customers that we're engaging with. And my friends do ask me, they say, what gives me confidence that BP can be successful in a new business like clean hydrogen? They know that we can do projects. They see the experience gained from engineering, building and operating some of the world's biggest commercial energy projects. They know that we can do subsurface reservoirs, and I must say it's great to see our engineers working on putting carbon back into the ground rather than taking it out. But what about customers? And for me, that's the best bit. We can work with our existing customers to move to low carbon alternatives. So we can move our truck customers to hydrogen. That's great. Our aviation customers will get sustainable fuels using hydrogen as an input. And our marine customers can move to low carbon hydrogen derived ammonia. And if we can move a fraction of our gas customers to hydrogen, that will be huge. And hydrogen is a great way to decarbonize high heat applications in industry or as a feedstock to low carbon fuels production. So we've signed MOUs across a range of industries in Teesside, and we're glad that the government is consulting on business models to support the use of hydrogen in as wide an appropriate set of sectors as possible. We have to make sure that the support for end users of the hydrogen goes hand in hand with and on the same timeline as low carbon hydrogen production. And although our hydrogen customers are based in Teesside, their products are nationwide. So when my dad paints his shed in Somerset, he'll be using paint elements that have been decarbonized in Teesside. The whole country benefits. When the farmer next door to my dad prepares his fields, the chances are he'll be using fertilizer that has been decarbonized in Teesside. The decarbonisation benefits us all. So to finish, final slide, summarize. So hydrogen is going to be big. It's happening now, and BP's in action. It's not just about talk, and that action is across production facilities. It's working with our customers to help them move to lower carbon alternatives, and it is working globally. My heart's very much in the UK, and I think Teesside is a great example of where we can start this decarbonisation revolution. Carbon capture through the Northern Endurance Partnership, clean power through NZT Power, and low carbon hydrogen through H2T Side, with the benefits felt nationwide. Thank you for your attention. Very happy to answer any questions later.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Matt. Very good to hear the overview and the role that BP can play. And I think really important the sort of points you make around the customers and the end users, and they've got to be aligned, that support for end users that goes hand in hand with the hydrogen production. And we've got to keep an eye on that to make sure that that as we develop hydrogen and those business models, that market will be there. We will now go on to our final speaker, and we will hear from Sam French from Johnson Matthey, who's Business Development Director there. Sam currently works leading the development of the strategy and programme for low carbon hydrogen at Johnson Matthey. And his previous roles there include Technology Manager for the Steam Reforming Catalyst and Technology R&D team. After moving from R&D into business development, he was tasked with developing a portfolio of new opportunities for processes from new feedstocks such as biomass waste and renewable energy. Sam represents Johnson Matthey on the Hydrogen Council Executive Group, as well as a number of other organisations focused on solutions to decarbonisation. So over to you now, Sam. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to join you today. I think, so very quickly, Johnson Matthey is a UK-based FTSE 100 company, just over 200 years old, but we're very much a global company with 15,000 colleagues across the globe. I think one of the key things is over 10% of Johnson Matthey employees work in R&D. So we're really focused on technology development, and sustainable technologies have always been at the core of what Johnson Matthey does. So I think I'm going to, if we move on to the next slide, I'm going to echo points made by Matt there, that what we're talking about here is building a new value chain. Clearly today, grey hydrogen is manufactured, and most of it from natural gas using steam methane reforming, and used in certain applications such as mentioned, production of fertilizer, methanol, and a lot in refineries in terms of reducing pollutants for road transport or transport fuels in general. What we're now talking about is hydrogen coming out of that area and spreading across multiple end applications, shown here on the right-hand side, where we're looking at transportation, particularly, I think, with a focus on the heavy end of that, so heavy-duty vehicles, trains, shipping, potentially into aviation, decarbonising industry, power generation, domestic heating, and then also, as mentioned, serving as a clean feedstock for industry. And we actually see that there's likely to be even increased amount of use of hydrogen in industry, where we're looking at things like sustainable aviation fuels, e-fuels, power to X type projects. Hydrogen production is absolutely key, but we do need to consider how we're transporting it. And one of the elements that hydrogen really is powerful will be playing as the buffering role, providing systems resilience. It's much easier to store energy in a molecule than as an electron. So whether we're storing excess renewables as hydrogen for times when there is no wind or no sun, or we're transporting hydrogen as ammonia or methanol, these are going to be critical factors. As mentioned, I've been very focused on the hydrogen production end. So if we flip onto the next slide, I think one thing that's interesting, we might have to press, it might have a couple of animations in there. There we go. And we'll keep going. Thank you. Well, unusually, I think where a lot of companies are focused on one specific area. As Johnson Matthey's providing sustainable technologies to our customers and partners, we're actually working all across this value chain. We've invested for over 20 years in developing fuel cells, have a very large factory here in the UK, as well as looking at how we can manufacture in a partnership with BP, sustainable aviation fuels, particularly focused on kind of biodiesels and into synthetic fuels for aviation. We've had a long track record in developing technologies in markets such as oxo alcohols and methanol, and that's been really important and critical in the work that we've been doing on the production side. So if we flip on to the next one, blue hydrogen. We're again, echo Matt's comments. I'm going to talk about both blue and green hydrogen and the work we're doing there. We are very supportive of the UK government's twin track approach. From a supply chain perspective, I think one of the critical elements that we want to be is we want to be leaders rather than followers. Being a leader will allow the UK to develop a supply chain that we can both implement within the UK, but then export globally. The key element about being a leader is that you de-risk the technology by deployment. When you've deployed and you've learned and you have those proof statements, it really reduces the risk profile and drives the desire to implement that technology that's proven. And that's how we can take it out around the world. We won't be able to do everything. This isn't about saying the whole supply chain, every element of that value chain will be delivered from the UK, but we really want to focus on the high value items that can deliver real growth in terms of the UK's position in this new market area. So if you go on to the next slide. In terms of blue hydrogen, what we've done is we've taken our knowledge and learning of the grey hydrogen market, where Johnson Matthey is one of the world leaders in catalyst supply, but also we've got a lot of experience, decades of experience in syngas generation. Now, syngas is a mix of CO, CO2 and hydrogen, which is what you get when you break natural gas or methane apart in a reforming process. What you then do with it after this central core element of this in this picture shown as this GHR and ATR, depends what product you want. But here what we're looking for is high purity hydrogen. But importantly, we're also looking to generate high purity and high pressure CO2. So what we've done is optimize the flow sheet. A lot of this looks similar to what you would have today on a grey hydrogen plant, but the real core element, this GHR, ATR, delivers much higher efficiency, which means we need less natural gas to produce hydrogen, and we produce less CO2 per unit of natural gas used as well. Driving efficiency is important, but also it's about how we get the products to the end of the flow sheet in the best form so we can capture the maximum amount of CO2 from this process. So critically here, what we're doing is we're injecting oxygen into the process stream to drive the reaction, rather than using natural gas as a fuel, burning it, combusting it, and then having to deal with very low concentration, highly dilute CO2 in a post-combustion stream. What that means is our CO2 removal unit is shrunk massively, which reduces the capex for this process. It means we can attain capture rates over 95%. Actually, in some of the projects we're working on, we can get up to 97, 98% capture rates. That's going to be critical when we come to establishing the credibility of blue hydrogen. I'm sure many of you saw the storm that was caused by the paper that came out of the US in the summer. That's why we believe this low carbon hydrogen standard that Will mentioned earlier is key to the credibility of this as an industry. And we will really be pushing that this is a high barrier to provide that credibility, to make sure the assets that go on the ground today, which will be around for 20 plus years, are really pushing forward and providing a solution that's viable for a net zero environment or a net zero energy system. Johnson Matthey, let me just say here, we are going to provide the technology blueprint, some of the proprietary equipment and the catalyst. We then work with an EPC contractor to deliver the project for the owner operator. Johnson Matthey isn't an owner operator. And we won't be making blue hydrogen, but we'll be pushing and innovating this technology to improve the efficiencies and performance. That means we have to work with partners and partnerships. And I think that's one of the key things that needs to develop in this space, is really strong interactions with companies such as BP, who are going to drive the investment and bring in the private sector investment required to deliver these very large projects in the UK. Quickly then, because I'm conscious of time and we want to get on to the Q&A. If we go on to the next slide, green hydrogen absolutely is going to be important. Very much agree with Matt. It depends where we are in the world, what the cost is. And really, when we're talking about costs here, we're talking about the cost, the levelized cost of renewable electricity. In areas of the world with low cost electricity, I think we really see green hydrogen is going to play a key role as well. Can you go on to the next slide, please? Again, Johnson Matthey is going to be looking at focusing on our key competencies, what we're good at. We are good at the chemistry and catalysis part of it. So we're focusing on the left-hand side at how you get the precious metal supply, how you refine those, how you make catalyst membranes and bring them together into catalyst-coated membrane. Working then with strategic partners to deliver, who will be making the electrolyzers and the systems that will deliver green hydrogen. At the other end, there's an interesting point though, that we are seeing a big growth in things like sustainable aviation fuels, e-methanol, and those are technologies that Johnson Matthey has. So again, we can work with partners to deliver projects taking green hydrogen, taking our technology for converting that into these end products to deliver to market. But one thing that's absolutely core is the end of life. What we need to be doing is designing for recycle. We must be making sure circularity is a real key element of any of the work we do. and there Johnson Matthey's the world's largest secondary refiner of precious metals. So we understand that circularity, the loop, how we make sure we've got these materials available to scale up. And if we go on to the next slide. Doing things at small scale is one element. However, one of the key points for green hydrogen is cost. We've mentioned that if you can access low cost renewables, you can drive down the cost of manufacturing green hydrogen. But the other critical element to reducing the cost of green hydrogen is going to be scaling up our manufacturing footprint. We would love to be doing that in the UK. And as I've mentioned earlier, we already have a large facility in Swindon making these key components for fuel cells. Fortuitously, that's also a very good manufacturing facility for making green hydrogen components, as well as the technologies are very similar. So we are doing this in a fully automated way. This is a factory running 24/7, making thousands and thousands or tens of thousands of meters squared of components today at high quality. But what we really need to be doing is growing the footprint for our supply chain, which will then lead to driving down costs. And if we go on to the next one, I believe that's me done. And I'm really happy again to answer questions in the panel session.
Thanks, Sam. That was a very clear presentation and some great points made there. I think really sort of emphasizing the points around the need to develop the UK supply chain and go for those high value items, so that the UK can be leaders rather than followers. I just wondered on the back of that, if you've got any, coming back to you, Sam, that what you think needs to be put in place really by the government to make sure that scaling up can happen.
Yeah, well, Will's on point for this one. One of the big things, obviously, is the business models. We know that for these large projects, both blue and green, what we need is the real subsidy model in the short term that's going to provide the strike price that delivers the return on investment, that brings the big numbers in that Matt was talking about. These projects will cost upwards of £1 billion. The quicker we can get the business models out and deployed, the better. But for the credibility of the market, we do need that low carbon hydrogen standard to be stringent. And I'm saying that from a technology developer's perspective, where maybe it's counterintuitive. What we want is an established, mature business that is credible, that the public can support, and that has a good lifetime in front of it. Without that, we won't see the development of the supply chain and the multiple projects we know we need to achieve net zero.
Yep, no, definitely agreed. Will, we have a couple of questions for you on ambition and target. The first one, that the Scottish Government also has a 5 gigawatt hydrogen production target by 2030. Does that mean the UK hydrogen target as a whole is in fact 10 gigawatts by 2030?
Thanks. So I think we think the 5 gigawatt ambition is stretching but deliverable, and that is a UK-wide ambition. I think there is obviously interactions with the devolved administrations in terms of Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and we are engaged with them in terms of the strategy package. Also, the business model is, and Net Zero Hydrogen Fund, for example, is UK-wide, and would be able to support projects across all parts of the UK. I think our view is the strategy package complements any sort of ambition set out in each devolved administration, really, and supportive of their plans.
Okay. And another one for you. Can you say a bit more about the roadmap for development of hydrogen networks, including the timeline for development of the necessary business models for small and large scale cluster networks? Does the 2035 gigawatt production ambition limit BEIS's ambition for development of hydrogen networks pre-2030?
Thanks. So, I mean, we definitely agree that there is networks have a vital role to play in terms of linking production with demand, and in particular growing out that demand as well. We are undertaking a review of hydrogen network requirements for both, I guess, initial projects and subsequent projects as well. Considering issues around funding, regulatory needs, interactions with other networks, for example, CCUS, CO2, transport and storage networks, gas and electricity. The outputs of that review will be published in the next strategy update, which will be in early 2022. I think there's also an interaction there with the business model, where we are potentially looking at whether the business model can support, for those initial production projects, a limited amount of networks to connect with, I guess, industrial facilities, power, for example, on a very small geographical scale. But definitely agree, as you continue to build out production, build out demand, networks become ever more important. And I think we would see them supporting the 2030 ambition. So it's not a post 2030 issue.
Can I quickly come in on that one as well? So I suppose I should say, so I chaired the working group on the 2020 deployment roadmap, which was a fantastic opportunity, and I think we had a really significant input in this from industry. What I would say is that at the moment, in terms of some of that 5 gigawatt ambition, you could see it coming in from localized clusters where we're getting a quite tight tie-up between supply and demand. But what was made critically important during that, during our discussions, was that we need to be thinking about what comes next. So if we start with these localized clusters, that's great, and that will be we can see that will seed the market. But the networks and the storage elements of how we join these together and how we then distribute hydrogen more broadly are critically important if we're actually to achieve some of the numbers that were shown in the hydrogen strategy as we build out through 2030s and 2040s. The key point was that these things take time to deliver, these infrastructure type projects of networks and storage. So whether we're using them in the 2020s or not, we need to be starting to plan and implement those kind of large infrastructure projects to make sure that we are ready for the ramp up that will come through the 2030s.
Yeah, I think it's keeping an eye on the future, and getting going now, looking at the clusters as a start, but keep to look forward and make sure that we're still gearing up constantly to be able to deploy at scale. Definitely. One now on economics. So a question on how are the economics of blue hydrogen impacted by rising gas prices? Or put differently, at what point does it become economic or profitable and green hydrogen becomes the only viable source? Very topical one. Does anyone want to go first on that one?
Shall I have a go? I think that's probably something that falls into the BP space. So I love this question because it comes from a place is we've got to make this economic, and we've got to kind of go to kind of the lowest cost form of low carbon hydrogen. So if gas prices go high, yeah, I absolutely agree that we don't want to be producing blue hydrogen if it's more expensive than green hydrogen. And when I speak to people within BP who are running gas businesses, I tell them that the only gas I'm interested in for a blue hydrogen project is reliable and low methane intensity. And so if they have gas that meets those criteria, I will have a conversation with them about supplying our potential blue hydrogen production facilities, because those are the critical things. And I do think that when we start building these blue hydrogen plants, people will see that that is an off-taker for long-term supply of low methane intensity gas, and there will be suppliers who will be wanting to kind of secure that long-term offtake. So I'm confident that there will be gas at an appropriate price and with the right methane intensity. And BP is hard at work on reducing methane intensity. So Olivia referenced my first job as an environmental engineer, and the mantra that we were told there was measure, control, manage. So BP is trying to improve its detection of methane emissions and to improve that measurement of methane emissions. When we do that, we can control it, and then we can manage it to a very low level. And we do publish our methane intensity because it is such an important thing, and it's reduced from about 0.2% down to 0.12% over the last 5 years, and I've every hope that it will continue on that trajectory. So yeah, we will only produce blue hydrogen if it is lower cost than local green and with a low carbon intensity and meeting that low carbon hydrogen standard.
Thank you. And I suppose, you know, so you have to sort of monitor the ongoing gas prices and make sure you can react to that. There was another question which I think you've answered. What's BP doing about reducing methane emissions to build more credibility in blue hydrogen? I think you've pretty much covered that. Is there anything else you want to add, Matt, in that area?
I mean, again, it's an area that I'm glad that BP is in action on, and I know that others are. So the industry is hopefully being moved to a place where all gas can be methane intensity. You always have to start with what you control best, which will be BP production. But again, I'm not interested in gas unless it is a low methane intensity.
Thank you. And then one for Sam. Is the prospect of utilising solid oxide electrolysis to produce carbon for industrial use from captured CO2 something you're currently looking into?
So we are looking at how you can essentially activate CO2 using electrochemistry, both through solid oxide and more technologies similar to PEM water electrolysis today. CO2 to CO is reasonably advanced, but this is still, you know, lab-based work. There is also activity going on looking at whether you can take CO2 and hydrogen through an electrolyzer directly to products. So can you get to methanol, for example, or one of the, you know, to a hydrocarbon such as that, olefins as well. Complexity is at the moment is more around selectivity. You end up making a bit of a soup of organics, which are then expensive and costly to separate. So short answer, yes, we're looking at it. Is it commercialized? Certainly not. Is it something we're working on? We hope to be able to do in the future, yes. Saying that, you know, you have to remember CO2 is a thermodynamically stable molecule, which is part of the problem. And you therefore do have to put a lot of electricity into it to reactivate it. The other thing we are looking at is, I mentioned some of our work around sustainable aviation fuels. So we have technology co-developed with BP, which currently is looking at waste through to sustainable aviation fuels, where you gasify it, you make syngas, and then you build up your chains, your hydrocarbon chains to make different fuel fractions. We're also looking in that space how you can take CO2 and green hydrogen by a process called reverse water gas shift, which again, essentially that's taking CO2 to carbon monoxide, and then again building up those chains to make liquid hydrocarbons for fuel. So there's both a kind of thermochemical route and an electrochemical route that we're exploring.
And what sort of timescales do you think you're on to then make those commercially viable? And
so the thermochemical routes are nearer term. We're already there's a plant that's just finishing construction and commissioning in the US using the technology to produce fuels from waste. That's at, I think it's something like 800 barrels a day. So it's not enormous at all by any refinery terms, but that's a kind of a commercialized demonstrator that will scale up. The process for taking CO2 and hydrogen through to fuels, that's also something that's commercialized, and we're working on initial deployments for that. I think the electrochemical piece is a little further behind, and probably the sort of the next 5 to 10 years before that will end up being commercialized.
Yeah,
I think this is real. I mean, so certainly in Teesside, we have an MOU with a manufacturer of sustainable aviation fuel using the municipal solid waste to aviation fuels using hydrogen as an input, low carbon hydrogen as an input. So it will take a little bit of time, but we know that the emissions from the aviation sector are important, and there are different routes to find a solution, and we should probably try all of them.
Yeah, and I suppose so. We talked about time, but there's a question on the fact that sustainable aviation fuel is 3 times more expensive than jet fuel. How do we scale up overpassing this barrier? So how do we really get to that point of scale?
So some of that is down to the scale of production. The larger we can get some of these facilities, the lower the cost. As we deploy, we will learn that will drive down costs. But we also have to realize that we'll have to drive up the cost of the alternatives. So that's the carrot and stick that we'll need to regulate and level these things out.
Yep. Will, do you want to come in on anything on that?
No, thanks.
Moving on, does it make sense for the UK to import gas and LNG for manufacturing blue hydrogen, or should we look to invest in UK domestic gas projects instead? Matt, should we come to you?
Yeah, so again, I approach this as a UK taxpayer, and I want to get the lowest cost hydrogen produced, and therefore I want the lowest cost low carbon methane to go into it. And if that is through imports, we do imports, and if it's from developing local gas, we do local gas. I think that obviously we have to put in place the right mechanisms and infrastructure to allow that gas to come to the UK freely. And if we do that, we should get to the lowest price gas to go into the blue hydrogen projects.
I suppose the one caveat back to your previous point though, Matt, is the carbon intensities of those different sources also are critical to take into account.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Sam. We need to be looking kind of like for any form of hydrogen, blue, green, or different colors, is kind of what is the end-to-end from kind of like building the kit that goes into the facility, plus any fuel consumed into it, and then how much CO2 is stored. I mean, you mentioned the higher capture rates for CO2 capture rates, which is fantastic to hear, and that's what we need to see. So yeah, it's all about lowest carbon intensity for lowest cost.
Yep, thank you. And we're interested, question interested in the panel's thoughts on hydrogen use, the timing of the split between industrial and domestic use. So I think really sort of coming back to that point of how do we scale up and build up those markets and demand that so it's in line with building up the supply manufacturing. Will, do you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, I can come in. So I think our view is that industry end use will play an important role in growing the market. It's a hard to abate sector, and I think that's where hydrogen has an important role to play. I think there's also increasing, projects coming forward around use of hydrogen in power projects, be it blending or fully converting to 100% CCGTs, for example. And again, I think that shows the flexible role of hydrogen in terms of decarbonising the economy and meeting our sort of net zero ambitions. I think on domestic use, I mean, people will know there's a lot of ongoing work around how you decarbonise the gas grid, homes, and so on. I think there's a potential role for hydrogen, but further work is needed on that compared to electrification. hybrid approaches, etc. So I think in my mind, that domestic sort of side is important, obviously, and decisions will be taken on whether hydrogen has a role to play in that. But I think nevertheless, hydrogen still has a really essential role to decarbonise the economy, particularly in those hard to abate sectors. And I think that was probably one of the key things to really come out when government adopted that sort of net zero ambition for 2050, moving from that sort of 80% sort of 2050 ambition to net zero. That brought out the essential role that hydrogen has to play to decarbonise those bits of the economy which are hard to abate, as well as potentially that role in heating.
Sam or Matt, do you want to come in on that? So whether we scale up industrial and use that to start, and role of domestic.
So I think.
Oh, sorry, Matt. Over you.
Okay, I think that we're starting in a place where we have very limited hydrogen production. I think that in the future we're going to have a lot of hydrogen production, and there's going to be hydrogen to go around. So yeah, starting with industry, because you can get to big volumes quickly, you can get to a high decarbonisation rate for the UK as a whole, makes sense. As somebody who lives in a house that might not lend itself to electrical heating, I am interested in the use of hydrogen for domestic use. I think it depends a lot on housing stock, where you live, whether kind of electric heating makes sense, or getting hydrogen to replace natural gas. As a supplier of low carbon hydrogen, I'll supply anybody. So I'm not gonna choose. I'll just be available to supply to whoever wants hydrogen. Sam?
Yeah, no, I think the one element, we've been very positive about the hydrogen strategy launch. Was great that it came out when it did and wasn't further delayed. I think the one bit that we would say could be further improved is, I think it's agree with Matt entirely that it's really good that we're focused on deployment at this stage, because that's how we're going to learn about these things. And industry does make a very good starting point. But we do need to develop our thinking and work out how we bring heating up to the same sort of level of understanding as we have for industry, and the same for some of the, the heavy end of the transport market.
Yeah, and I think it's about understanding, the different, it's not necessarily going to be one size fits all. And as you said, Matt, you will supply where it's wanted and appropriate. But I think, recognizing that we need to develop all technologies and keep those moving. One very final question. More of a statement. Can we recognise that hydrogen storage is different from natural gas storage arbitrage, especially as we diversify supply sources plus new users? Does anyone want to comment on that?
So I think storage of hydrogen is really important. So we're going to be hopefully building plants that have very high operability and uptime, but there will be times when plants aren't available and there'll be fluctuations in demand, and all of this will require some form of hydrogen storage. So it's something that we're working on. We know it's important, so I think I'd agree with whoever's put that point of view that it is important, and it is different to natural gas storage.
Thank you. I'll just give the panel any final comments before we close up this session. Matt or Sam? Will? No.
No. Thanks again for the opportunity to speak today.
Onwards to deployment. I think that's it. Let's stop the talking and the studies and get some of this stuff on the ground.
Get actually happening. Yeah, thank you. And thank you all for speaking today. It's been a really interesting session. And yeah, I think that's the key point. Let's, welcome the twin track approach taken by government and need to push onwards towards deployment. We just, before we finish, I'll just flag the next couple of sessions. Our next session begins at 12 noon. It's being led by the CCSA's European and ZEP colleagues, discussing the influence of EU policy frameworks and the key role that CCS will play to 2030. And I know that our office in London has been working with our European colleagues, particularly on developing our responses to these hydrogen consultations. So it's crucial that we work across with our European colleagues on that. And then at 1:30, it's our final session, Increasing International CCUS Ambition, which asks how can we ensure that the UK's policies, programmes and actions remain pivotal to international CCUS efforts and delivering on the Paris Agreement. So we hope you can join us all for those, and thank you all for your contributions today, and thank you to the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.